So many of us drink a lot of caffeine because we feel like it's going to help our ADHD. Definitely does feel that way, right? Like it gives us that little bit of a boost that we need to get through our day. But what if I told you that that is just a myth? Buckle up. What you're going to listen to is going to be mind-blowing. Okay, so let's just quick chat caffeine. If you have ADHD, you probably know and understand caffeine intimately. Honestly, some of the biggest caffeine drinkers I've ever known have ADHD. One of my friends consistently has 3 different types of caffeine on her desk every single time she is essentially awake and doing work. But anyway, if you have ADHD, you are probably familiar with that love for caffeine. And according to the research, yeah, that's accurate. So people with mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, and ADHD, all drink significantly more caffeine than the general population statistically. Super interestingly, we're also at a higher risk for developing something called caffeine use disorder, which is essentially an extreme version of caffeine dependence. So basically, caffeine use disorder is described as when we have a huge desire to cut down on our caffeine use. However, every single time we try, there is this big mental block, or our body is essentially rebelling against that. And then we're unable to reduce our caffeine intake because of those significant withdrawal symptoms. Interestingly, that study that found people with ADHD are at a higher risk of developing caffeine use disorder, they found that caffeine consumption, so you know like how much we drink, is not associated with ADHD severity. I know what you're thinking. How the heck does that even make sense? Because how can someone who is more likely to have a caffeine use disorder not get exacerbated symptoms from their ADHD based on how much caffeine they're drinking? And seriously, when I read that a few years ago, I was also mind blown because it doesn't make sense, but it will, trust me. So before we get into that, let's just talk about how caffeine actually impacts our brain. So when we drink caffeine, it travels all the way into our brain and then shoves out a neurochemical called adenosine. Based on how much you know about caffeine, you've probably heard a little bit about adenosine, but for those who don't know, adenosine is a neurochemical that is really important in regulating our sleep-wake cycle. So when we wake up, our levels are pretty low, and then it rises throughout the day, peaking at when we are about to go to sleep, and then as we sleep, it decreases. This is actually why a lot of people benefit from a midday nap. When we take a nap, it clears off excess of that, and then it can help us focus. So taking that nap, for example, caffeine does something similar. However, instead of actually reducing the adenosine in our brain, it blocks the adenosine from being acknowledged by the brain. So over time, when we consume a lot of caffeine, it can actually increase the amount of receptors our brain has to the adenosine simply because it is confused about why is the adenosine not being listened to. So I like to use the example of noise-canceling headphones. So the noise is the brain's natural tiredness signal, and that's the adenosine. When you drink caffeine, it blocks the background noise, and so you can focus, you can power through, you can feel alert, even though the tiredness is still happening in the back of your brain. Over time, your brain recognizes that we're not being responsive to the adenosine, and so it goes out and buys some hearing aids, aka building more adenosine receptors. And then one day you take off those noise-canceling headphones, and suddenly the noise is so much louder than before. That is the brain fog, the flu that you get when you try to go off caffeine, the irritability, everything about caffeine withdrawal that really, really sucks. Thankfully, give it a few days to a few weeks depending on how caffeine dependent you are, and the adenosine receptors do go back to normal. So that's the biggest reason why it's not necessarily considered something that's going to help ADHD. The reason is because it doesn't immediately act on dopamine or norepinephrine. Instead, it acts on adenosine. Of course, caffeine can impact dopamine, but it's mainly through a secondary process, through the adenosine just not being responded to. Okay, now that we got the brain stuff out of the way, are we super sure it doesn't affect ADHD? Because for a lot of us, it can really feel like it helps. Considering how it impacts the brain, it also might make sense that it could make the ADHD worse in the long run. But here's the thing. Sometimes conventional wisdom and logic don't translate to real life. In fact, we have a huge number of studies essentially proving that caffeine, simply put, does not impact ADHD, which is a huge win for all y'all who are drinking way too much caffeine probably. For instance, this 2023 meta-analysis found that it has no impact on kids, and then this 2022 review found the same for adults. And then remember how I talked about how caffeine use disorder is associated with ADHD, but not specifically caffeine consumption? Well, that study also found that quality of life was really important. Essentially, caffeine use disorder is associated more with how a person feels, how is their life going, instead of how a person is experiencing ADHD symptoms. That means the more positively you view your life, the less impactful caffeine might be on your general health, at least your general mental health. That being said, something I've noticed in my clinical work is that people who are consuming a lot of caffeine also tend to experience more of some nervous system dysregulation, and also they tend to experience more of that ADHD burnout because we feel like we can continue to go and go and go, and then since it is also an appetite suppressant, it can essentially reduce our brain's ability to remind us that we need to eat, which for a lot of people with ADHD is already difficult. If that is you, I have a few ebooks in my NutriMind community that you might benefit from. So the first is Practical Regulation. It teaches you how to identify when your body is out of regulation, and then it also has over 50 different nervous system regulation exercises that you can use depending on what type of nervous system dysregulation you're experiencing. And then the second is the ADHD Burnout Ultimate Guide, and this one explains why people with ADHD experience more burnout, how to recognize it in your ADHD body, and then proven strategies to help based on your level of burnout. So again, you can find all of that in the NutriMind community, and I will have that linked below as well as in my bio. Now, it's also important to look at genetics when we think about all of this. So there's a specific gene polymorphism that is connected with a higher risk of developing caffeine use disorder, and unsurprisingly, it's also connected to ADHD. So at the end of the day, like with everything, it kind of comes down to just the interaction between your genes, your environment, and how we perceive the world. All right, now let's talk about caffeine and sleep, because I know a lot of y'all probably have some questions about that. So interestingly, there's a huge range of experiences with caffeine and sleep with ADHD. So me personally, I'm one of the people who, when you drink caffeine, I will crash. And then there's the people who, when you drink caffeine, it actually makes you feel like you're more in control, more focused. And I do get that experience a little bit, but it really just kind of makes me go straight to sleep. And that's the thing. There is such a huge, wide range of experiences. This study is one that was super interesting, and it looked at kids with caffeine use, and it found that even though the kids had the caffeine and they felt like their sleep quality was worse, it actually wasn't translated to a worsened sleep quality in reality. And that's even another intersection we need to consider, because our brains and how we perceive the world can be different from reality. I think that's just a fun conversation in general, because a lot of the time it comes down to belief. What do we believe? And then that translates how we see the world and how we see ourselves fitting into the world. It's really similar to what I was talking about with a caffeine use disorder and the quality of life that the person is having and their beliefs about their quality of life. It's just very fascinating, and I hope it's empowering to know that delusion sometimes is a good thing. I mean, I personally live in a little bit of a delusional world sometimes. I don't know, I'm not gonna lie. I like to view life through the lens of I can do pretty much anything that I put my brain to. And sometimes it doesn't work, but it does other times, and so that's okay. And just searching for the positives, feeling the gratitude as we look through it. But anyway, back to sleep. Okay, so thinking about sleep and the research, we actually have proof that it doesn't affect people's sleep for some reason, for some people. But then it actually does affect some people's sleep quality as well, and it's just very confusing. And so that's where I personally take a conservative approach with drinking caffeine. I just recommend not drinking caffeine past noon. Until we get more solid research on this evidence of some people don't and some people do, I just believe in erring on the safe side. And considering sleep quality is one of the most important things to consider with improving or making your ADHD symptoms worse, secondary to stress in my opinion. I just recommend being safe about it, because we don't want to make our ADHD worse through worsened sleep quality. And then if we want to make everything even more complicated, there's also the interaction of the type of caffeine we consume. So for example, some energy drinks contain little to no health benefit, whereas some drinks like coffee or tea have a lot of incredible phytonutrients phytonutrients or plant nutrients that could actually improve ADHD and mental health in general. I will say, of course, some energy drinks, they do contain some amazing B vitamins, things like that. And so if you are drinking an energy drink, take a look at the ingredients. What is actually in it that's going to benefit you? Because if it's just the caffeine, maybe consider getting your caffeine from a better source. And here is why. So take, for example, green tea. There was a study that looked at the combination of L-theanine and caffeine. And essentially what they found was that the people who had just caffeine made more errors, whereas the people who had the caffeine plus L-theanine combination, that kind of disappeared. Of course, it was a very small study. There were only 6 participants, and that doesn't mean we can conclude a lot of helpful things from it. However, I will say it's a very important preliminary study that could give us just some more reason to combine the caffeine with those important phytonutrients that are so helpful in regulating the negative effects potentially of caffeine. Another common one would be coffee. So this study actually found drinking 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day can have a protective effect on depression and anxiety. And I know what you're thinking.
Monica, what the heck? Caffeine can actually improve your anxiety? I thought it was the opposite.
And honestly, I do not drink a lot of caffeine because personally it impacts my anxiety and it can make me feel like my heart is racing or I'm very jittery or things like that. But it's more of the body anxiety for me, and I think that's a very important distinction. It's still essentially a state of fight and flight for your body, but I feel like it's a little bit different for my mind. That all being said, a lot of people with ADHD do experience depression and anxiety, and so coffee could be a beneficial thing for us. The reason for that, again, is the complex interplay of all those different nutrients that are combining together to make coffee be a good thing for us, rather than just the caffeine. I will say, though, that the study found the effects were significantly decreased when they had the sugar-sweetened versions of the coffee. So if you remember from the video, I'm going to just pin it right here, about sugar-sweetened beverages and their impact on ADHD and our brain and the long-term effects. Yeah, maybe just consider not getting a daily dose of sugar from Starbucks. Now, that all being said, since we know that caffeine isn't going to negatively affect ADHD, apparently according to the research, is there ever a point when we drink too much caffeine? The answer is yes. Just like everything, dose makes the poison. And there is typically always a very small range of amounts where it's the perfect amount for people. So the dietary guidelines recommend that we consume no more than 400 milligrams of caffeine a day if you're an adult. The reason for this is because it's been associated with many negative things once we drink more than the 400 milligrams of caffeine a day. So some examples are increased anxiety severity, increased risk for diabetes too, cardiovascular risk increases, and there's so much more. In fact, this study found that drinking 6 or more cups of coffee a day was associated with a 53% increased risk for dementia. Super interestingly, they found the sweet spot here was 1 to 2 cups of coffee a day, and it could have a protective effect. So again, like I said, there is this sweet spot of caffeine for optimal functioning for the majority of people. And that sweet spot tends to be about 120 milligrams to 250 milligrams of caffeine per day for an adult. Now, keep in mind some foods actually contain caffeine as well. So for me, I take about 2 tablespoons of cocoa powder every single morning, and that is some of my caffeine for the day. And I just encourage you to take a good look at what you are eating and drinking and see how you can reduce your caffeine consumption if necessary, or potentially increasing it depending on how you and your body feel. And last, I really want to emphasize that adults are very different from kids. So when we look at the recommendations for kids and the research with kids, we actually see that under 6 years old, it's recommended to not have any caffeine at all. And then between the ages of 6 and 14, consuming no more than 100 milligrams. And then past 14, it's about 250 milligrams. One of the biggest reasons for this isn't because of some of those other things I mentioned, but is mainly because of the mental health risk associated with it when you are a kid drinking caffeine. So for example, this study on caffeine consumption in adolescents actually found that drinking caffeine was associated with an increased risk of incident anxiety, meaning they more likely wouldn't have developed it later on if they didn't consume the caffeine as a child. So again, this is where I just encourage you to look toward the dietary guidelines because they are there for a reason. caffeine, they have a lot of research backing it, and to be honest, most of us don't actually follow them because we just don't know what they are. So putting all of this together, what does this mean for us? Okay, here's the main takeaways. Number 1, caffeine does not impact ADHD. Even though it might feel like it does, it technically doesn't. Number 2, moderate consumption of caffeine in adults seems to have a neuroprotective effect, meaning drinking about 120 milligrams to 250 milligrams of caffeine a day could potentially actually make our brains work better. Number 3, when we are consuming caffeine, ideally we are making sure that it is plant-based caffeine as well as sugar-free or low-sugar versions of the plant caffeine. So think coffee, tea, cocoa powder, things like that, and ideally we're not adding a lot of added sugar to them. Number 4, overconsumption of caffeine can harm our health in the long run. So take a good look at your life and make sure that we're not drinking more than 400 milligrams of caffeine a day. 5, children should be closely monitored with their caffeine intake. The reason is that for some reason, even though it helps adults, it can actually harm the children. And last, just listen to your body. You know yourself the best. For me, like I said, I don't drink a lot of caffeine. It has the tendency to make me feel jittery and I crash. But if I do drink caffeine, I always try to pair it with a protein source, and then I always try to make sure that my nervous system is as regulated as it can be before consuming it. Now, if there was anything surprising that jumped out to you, I'd love to hear it in the comments, or if you have an experience with caffeine that you want to share, I'd also love to hear it. So I respond to all the comments I can, and I just really enjoy making a conversation and community. And if you love what I do, which is sharing nutrition research for ADHD based on the evidence and not on the anecdotes, make sure you're following me or subscribing based on whether you're listening to the podcast or watching on YouTube. And last, as always, huge shout out to my Patreon members for making sure that all of this is possible. Now, if you have ADHD and you made it through all of this, I'm very impressed, and here are a few videos that you might be interested in.